Welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. Hunting aggressively in late October comes with its risks, but it may be what's needed to get that buck that you've been chasing. All right, welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. Thank you for listening as always. Thank you for tuning in. So in this episode, I'm going to do a breakdown of basically some of the newer tactics I've been doing this year. Again, being much more aggressive than in years past. And so far, it's been working out in my favor. Now, I certainly have been battling with getting in the right area, getting deer in front of me, but just not being able to capitalize on that, which I will discuss more in detail a little bit later here. But during late October, I feel is an excellent time to make some aggressive moves when it comes to chasing a particular mature buck or just getting on deer if you haven't been seeing them earlier in the season. But before we get into it, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share the show with your friends. If you want a little bit more, if you want to explore a little bit more of what the show has available, head on over to mihuntingpodcast.com. Check out the full library of content available. So all of the podcasts as well as every video that is released is on the website as well. And if you want to gain a little bit or to gain additional access, become a member. Your membership supports this show directly, as well as grants you access to a monthly live show, discounts to everything in the store, and a members only giveaway. So let's get into the topic at hand. So this year, like I've said, it's been quite an experience of making a lot of moves that I hadn't done in the past. So there's kind of a combination of kind of a balance between my areas I hunt on public land as well as the private piece. So a lot of these maneuvers I've been making, they really only pertain to what I've been doing on public land. Certainly with the size of the parcel and kind of what my goal is down on the private piece, with my food plots and my stand placement, that place, I'm not going to be very aggressive in regards to pushing into areas, kind of areas I kind of designate as my sanctuary areas or areas that are deemed, bedding essentially. With that smaller parcel, you're not able to really chase down the deer. Now you could, with some scouting and whatnot being done, you could, potentially determine that, maybe where you had set up your stand, during the off season is not necessarily the right spot and feel like you have to move it to make sure you're in the game, especially as we get closer to the rut time frame. Certainly that type of move would be, one that would be, I would advise in that regard to, what you had for your permanent stand. If it's not in the right location, if you know that area is just a dud and you're just not going to get the movement or not get the deer in range, then that would certainly be the move that you should make. And, it all depends on, how much disturbance you think that's going to cause, on whether or not you should move that in season or just kind of chuck that one as a loss and then during the off season make that move later. That's for you to decide really in that regard. A lot of these moves that I've been making, again, have been on public land. And, I talked about this in previous episodes as well, where, some of the spots that I would hunt would be, I would consider, kind of a safe spot, on the edge of a clear cut or, maybe near a pocket of oaks, kind of in like a transition area. And, those are great spots. I mean, where especially in big woods, where that's where going to be a concentration of deer. And, certainly a viable, way to, approach those areas and hunt deer. I kind of chalk it up to kind of two different styles of hunting where I kind of dubbed it kind of the passive hunting as well as active hunting. I call it passive, but it's, I don't really like that term. I guess it makes it sound more negative, but it but it's really, not a trying to make a dig at that style of hunting, that where you set up in an area that's, known travel corridor, or just a known area where you're going to get deer that are going to come through. That's certainly a tried and true way to hunt. I mean, most of the deer that I have harvested, have been harvested in that manner. One thing I have noticed is that even if a spot is really good, it has a lot of deer sign, and you have a scrape or buck rubs or something like that, that sometimes those areas can be inconsistent in regards to how often the deer come through, time of day, and then basically kind of their direction of travel, really. A prime example is, the one I've discussed again, where I was on the edge of a clear cut. A buck came through basically out of the clear cut heading into the timber. And then, so I made a little bit of a move over to that end of the clear cut where he was. Next time I saw him, he was basically out where he came out of the timber into the clear cut, basically right next to where I was sitting the time before. And it just seemed like that cone shape of movement was just a little too wide. If it was during rifle season or something like that, it would have been no problem. But during bow season, it just keeps those deer, basically kind of keep you guessing as to where you can set up to where you can get a shot based on, their direction of travel. So that's why, again, in this location, I decided that for this year, after doing some, out of season or off-season scouting, to push into the timber more and try to, fine-tune where those deer are coming from. Again, that was something that I talked about where, being just a little more aggressive, getting in there a little bit deeper, a little bit higher risk of potentially bumping deer coming in there. You're going into the timber where they could be potentially bedding. A lot of times you'll find there's a lot more trails that kind of crisscross, intersect throughout there. So you could have deer that are coming from kind of unknown directions, or, you're going to have a hard time not crossing over a deer path to get to where your designated stand is. So that's that more active approach that I'm kind of taking where, basically even with that, now I find myself a couple different encounters with a buck. The first one I had set up, there was a known kind of community scrape that I had a camera on. I've gotten good camera intel indicating that there was lots of does using it, smaller bucks, and then this big wide, essentially 8-pointer came through, and I moved in on him thinking that he was going to use that main trail along the scrape. He ended up taking another path and busted me at about 10 yards. Basically came right out underneath me through the cover and never got my opportunity at him. From there, I ended up moving and switching to basically another tree, only probably about 20 yards from where that encounter, or where my previous stand was, basically giving me a shot opportunity at that trail that buck used, as well as I could still see the scrape off in the distance. It was about 42 yards, but there was some brush and limbs in the way that I can't shoot through or shoot at that scrape anymore, but I can shoot a little bit further off to the side, the trail that scrape is on. So kind of gave up a little bit of ground in regards to being able to shoot that scrape, but put me in a better position to where that deer is less likely to get behind me. Now, unfortunately, just this morning, I sat in that spot again, climbed up in that tree. Another thing that I considered when setting up is being able to get a little bit higher up in the tree. So I did add some aiders to my climbing sticks just to get me another, 3 or 4 feet higher, making sure I'm well out of basically that line of sight for a deer as it's walking through. So, and if you listen to the previous episode from when that buck spooked out of that area for that first time I had an encounter with him, he basically kind of looped out at around like 50, 60 yards out and behind me, behind some cover, and then headed out to the direction that he was going. So the goal was to try to basically kind of make sure that he didn't get behind me, as well as try to hopefully be able to get a shot again off closer to that timber or that cover that was behind me in the first place, to where if a deer did go back that direction, I could still get a shot. As I had seen some does traveling back back behind that cover on previous hunts as well. So on this morning's hunt, basically anticipating that either a deer is going to come out on that main trail where the scrape is, or hopefully that buck was going to take the same path that he did the first time I saw him, cross in front of me at about 10 yards. Unfortunately, that's not what ended up happening. So this morning, that buck, as well as a smaller, he kind of looked like he was kind of beat up a little bit, but he might have been like a small 8-pointer or something like that. They basically came through behind me yet again, taking another trail up behind that cover. Unfortunately, they got into a spot where they were going, I didn't really have a good shot opportunity. There was just too much brush and stuff in the way. Finally, when they did pause behind a little bit of cover, they ended up kind of taking a couple steps back behind, basically kind of heading back the direction they came from. So from there, I was able to kneel down a little bit in anticipation that if they were to step back out one way or the other, that now that was a lower, advantage point. I could sneak an arrow through. Unfortunately, these at least this deer, anyways, he seems to be one step ahead of me. He actually walked directly away behind the cover, and he was actually quiet enough where I was unsure even if he had left in the first place. As they were coming in, I could hear them, stomping the leaves and whatnot. But when they left, it was really hard to tell as if they actually left or still were just milling around behind that cover a little bit. Ultimately, ended up that they did take off. I did make a few calls out in that direction to see if there was any response or anything spooked, but there was nothing. I guess one other really cool thing was is one of the very first times I've actually heard a buck do a snort wheeze. Now, I don't know if it was ultimately the bigger of the two bucks. I'm assuming it was, but basically when they're behind the cover, I heard that the distinct sound of a snort wheeze, which was pretty cool to hear. Kind of one of the first times, especially having it not really be in the prime rut time where they're really going to be fired up, and the fact that they're kind of hanging out kind of surprised me that I heard that sound anyways. But it was pretty cool nonetheless. So basically in that hunt, again, pushing into that spot, and I'm starting to get the understanding that if you push into these areas especially where the deer are not used to being hunted, that sometimes even if you spook them, so in the instance of that one where he caught the movement and he spooked out, I feel as though that's not going to be a make or break for you, where certainly my mindset in years past would be that if you end up spooking a deer like that, then they're gone. Like, they're not coming back. But I'm starting to learn that it all depends on exactly how and when you spook them. Certainly I feel as though is that if they wind you, if they catch your scent, then they're going to be far more likely to avoid the area now that they truly know what that was and are going to avoid it. Especially if they hear you, if they don't really get a good look at you, and they only hear maybe you going through the leaves, or if you break a stick or something like that, those types of things happen all the time in the woods, where there's going to be a certain noise, a certain animal comes through. Maybe it's another deer that can make that noise and put another deer on edge in that regard. If that's the case, then there's a good likelihood that those deer aren't going to go very far, and you may get another opportunity. If if they see you, again, that's a little bit harder or a little bit more severe of a spook or a push, I guess you could say, or a bump, I guess, whatever you want to use the term. It may take them a little bit longer to come back from that, or it may not be as significant as you think. It all depends on the deer, of course. There is some interesting or very telling data that came out of the MSU Deer Lab, where they did track that buck or how bucks react to hunter pressure, and they definitely basically what they end up coming up with, or what they found, was that a buck is not necessarily going to move less. So they're not going to spend necessarily more time laying down or off their feet. What they are going to do is, they basically the example was given is that if a buck has, will travel a mile in a day, once they feel any hunter pressure, they're still going to move about that same mile, but they're just going to do it in a much smaller area. So I don't remember the exact term that they use. They have a scientific term for what it's called. But basically, they're going to have their full range, or their home range, we'll say. And then they get spooked or they feel some hunter pressure. And then they're going to condense that down into that smaller core area, or a smaller area where they feel more secure. So they're going to, again, more than likely end up sticking around to areas that are high stem count, higher, denser cover, and they will move. They'll do their daily movement within that area instead of their full range. So I think that if you get into, if you're able to push into where more of that core range, or tighter into that, or peers into that home range a little bit further, spook or that bump, they'll feel it, but then it's still going to be within the area that they feel very comfortable with. So again, with this area, it is very dense, very thick cover. And I think that, even though I ended up having that encounter where that buck did spook, he did basically stay around in the area. Now, the one thing I did notice too is that the fact that he went up further away from that main trail that he had that negative encounter with me, I think that is a little bit telling that he was still a little hesitant to walk down that trail, but not going to abandon the area altogether. So that was something that, I thought could be the case, that he would just circle a little bit further out. Again, I misjudged on my ability to be able to shoot that direction if they did kind of circle out or kind of take a wider, path around that area. So, certainly going forward, this is going to be something I'm going to take in consideration, that if I end up spooking a deer or bumping a deer where I'm at, that potentially, moving 40, 50, 60 yards from that area to where another area where that deer may feel safer crossing through. So they're still going to want to travel through there. It's just now they're going to might avoid that area. So you just kind of circle around a little bit to cut them off where they think you're not going to be this time, and potentially capitalize in that regard. If I'd done a little bit better surveying of the area, I might have been able to anticipate that a little bit better and would have gotten a shot this morning. So another instance again of being more aggressive is I started doing this a little bit more last year, was basically on my way out, scouting my way out, or basically kind of surveying the area as I walk back to the truck. This year I've taken that to the next step of doing a lot more in-season scouting, even when it comes to after a hunt. So another good example is again on another spot where I've got some camera intel of a really nice heavy framed 8-pointer. Basically it's coming from an old overgrown egg field, cutting through the cover, and then heading up a very steep embankment up to a bedding area. Basically what I ended up doing was trying to capitalize on that movement. There was a lot of rubs that kind of funnel down to this main trail that head up to the hill. And then also I end up doing a mock scrape, and now it's become quite the community scrape where, it started out basically like I kind of made like a little 3-foot diameter scrape with a licking branch over top. Now it's opened up to almost a 5-foot diameter scrape where a lot of the does are checking out, and then almost every buck that comes through either messes with the licking branch or actually is pawing at the ground and basically maintaining that scrape for me. Ultimately, I got a picture of that buck. It was about 8 a.m., probably about a week and a half ago now. And so I figured, he came through with a north wind the day after significant rain, which we had that over the course of the weekend. So I went in there thinking that, maybe he's going to repeat that movement. Ultimately, the only thing that I saw that morning was a doe first thing in the morning, even before shooting light. So end up, I've ran into this situation before hunting at my mom's place where, it was just it was a travel corridor where I had a lot of good bucks coming through. The problem is that if it was a smaller parcel, so I was limited on, I had to solely rely on the deer to come through within shooting light. More often than not, especially as we got later into the season and that daylight window started to shrink, those deer would just start showing up before shooting light, and I would not get an opportunity. So from this spot, knowing that that is the potential, now I could certainly stick in that spot and just kind of wait it out, and knowing that sooner than later, or at some point, I guess I should say, that deer would probably come back down through that trail during daylight, and I would get an opportunity. Part of the issue is that, if I stuck it out, I could probably make it happen, but I'm just kind of sitting there and, putting the ball in the deer's court, where basically they get to determine if that's going to happen or not. So what I ended up doing was, ultimately what I decided to do is I was going to circle around and get up into that bedding area where I suspected that buck was bedding, or that there may be other deer bedded up in that area as well. So circled around downwind, found an area where I could at least climb this hill. It is very steep, and I don't even know how many feet of elevation difference it is, but it's quite a bit. Was able to sneak up into there without making too much noise or too much racket. Basically ended up dumping a lot of my gear, left my backpack down at the base of the hill, climbed up with just my bow and my binaural harness, my rangefinder, and headed up. As I suspected, once I got up there, things were basically primed for deer to be bedded in there. It was a lot thicker, and there's still so much vegetation up there, a ton of deadfalls, so there's lots of sunlight that got in there, so a lot of understory growing up in there. Last time I was up there was last year in December when there was snow, and it was definitely looked a lot more open at that time, or that time of year, whereas now it definitely was far more grown in, to where it looked primed for deer to be bedding up there, as I suspected. So from there, basically I wanted to check a few of these different points. There's a lot of little valleys and holes in this up on top of this ridge here. So started making my way slowly through, basically just doing like a still hunt, just kind of creeping my way through, trying to be as quiet as possible, keeping the wind in my, as much in my face as I can. Basically it was kind of like a northwest wind, and I was basically coming from, essentially coming from the east. So basically allowing that wind to be in my favor more, so that my scent wasn't certainly blowing, ahead of me, to where, maybe I could, see a deer, or even potentially get a shot opportunity at deer before they bolted out of there. As I was creeping up through some of the understory, I could see, so basically seeing some deer legs coming through. So I paused, taking out my binoculars, just kind of watching. In that process, I ended up not being able to see the deer anymore. So ultimately there was a little bit of a dip and a big deadfall in between me and the deer. So set it out, waited a couple minutes, and then proceeded to creep up a little bit further. I made it probably about another 15 yards or so. And from there, I'm assuming that the deer either caught my movement or did hear me, because I wasn't able to be perfectly quiet, of course. And saw the deer get up, kind of circle around, and kind of move up the other side of the hill, just on the other side of the cover. Again, they didn't blow, they didn't bust out completely. They just certainly were, unsure of what was making that noise coming towards them. Again, waited another couple minutes, and then proceeded to, head into there to where that deer was. Basically, I wanted to see exactly what that looked like underneath that cover, to see what it was that they were attracted to, why that deer was there. Moved up a little bit further, probably about another 10, 15 yards. And next thing I know, another deer jumps up. I don't know if it really was laying down, but I just caught the movement as it, definitely started to move with haste. It was a much bigger deer. I couldn't necessarily see the full rack, but I could tell it was a big, heavy framed, antlers on top of his head, and it looked like a big, a good size body on the deer. It ended up moving basically up the hill and then over the next little knoll to where I couldn't see it anymore. So it certainly looked encouraging that, those deer or that buck was certainly up in there. I'm suspecting it's the big 8-pointer that I've been kind of watching in the area. But again, I'm not 100% sure because I didn't get the best to look at them. From there, again, kind of sat there, gave it a minute or two, pulled out my phone, looking at the map, and basically looking at that, that little knoll kind of circles back around. There's a bowl, and then there's a little valley off to the one side, thinking that maybe if that deer, tries circling back around or tries circling downwind of whatever it thinks that spooked it, that may be, potential shot opportunity for, to capitalize on that. So, because again, that deer, it didn't bolt out of there. It just kind of knew that it needed to kind of create some space. So checked out the little area down where those deer were, found a few rubs, didn't see anything significant that was definitely like, yep, they were bedded here, but there was significant buck sign in that area. Proceeded to move a little bit further, again, heading downwind from where I was, hoping that maybe I might catch that deer if he tries to circle back and try to catch the wind of whatever it was that spooked it. As I proceeded to do that, about another 50 yards from there, or from where I spooked the deer from, end up finding a small scrape or a couple small scrapes that are kind of together just on the back side of that cover area. Again, pulled out my phone to document that I found the scrape there on my mapping. And after I got it into my phone, I was just kind of kneeling there, kind of squatted down, and just kind of sitting there listening to see if I could hear any movement. And as I was sitting there, just thinking, it just kind of dawned on me that where I was at, I wasn't necessarily propped up against a tree or tucked in a cover house. This kind of like in this little tiny, like 3 to 4 foot patch of open. And, I just sat there and all of a sudden realized that, maybe I should get behind some type of cover. I feel kind of exposed or kind of, like I'm sticking out like a sore thumb here. And ended up, grabbing my bow. And as I went to move to get behind a big maple tree, I hear, basically up on the hill above me, a deer taking off. I look up and it must have been that first deer that spooked out. He must have already done that maneuver of kind of on the hill, creating some distance and space, and then was waiting to see what ended up spooking it as he was standing downwind of where he was originally. He blew out of there. I guess he didn't blow, but he took off out of there, having seen me. It was definitely much more of a significant encounter where that deer definitely was getting out of there with some significant haste and proceeded to go up the hill and then down over the backside, down into that next valley. So, and again, that kind of plays into that higher risk factor of, doing that type of thing where, that first deer, when he spooked the first time, he didn't completely get out of the area. When he spooked that second time, that's when he definitely bugged out of there with some vigor and was not going to stick around to be pressured anymore. So it's one of those things that, if I had maybe a little bit more experience or, I really chalk it up to that, where just the experience of not having been in that area or know exactly the terrain all that well up there, as well as not having, significant encounters with deer, doing that still hunting style or working in there on the ground with my bow. It is one of those things that if I had, a rifle, then I probably would have potentially been able to capitalize on both those deer and harvest them. With the bow, again, is much more difficult. You gotta get them in range to be able to do that, and they gotta hold still for you. So it's one of those things that, yes, did I bugger up that area a little bit when it came to both those deer getting bumped? Yes, but now the intel that I've gathered from that encounter far outweighs the negativity or the negative encounter that I had with them. I fully believe that those deer are going to continue to go up on top of that ridge. They are more likely going to stay in that little bowl where I first encountered them. But now I get to have the opportunity where I can, again, get down into that funnel of movement. So being down at the base of the hill, that's a pretty tight area of movement, but it's not perfect. There's multiple trails that go up on top of that hill, and they can even come from, basically out of range to get up there. They can take one of those other trails, or you can come from a completely different direction. From there, if I really wanted to play it safe, I'd go further out to the field edge. And on that, certainly viable. I know that those deer are going to be out in that field at some point, but that funnel of movement or that area to be able to cover becomes far greater, where there's a far more likelihood that they are going to get too far out of range or not even come within range at all, or they'll be so far out that I won't even see that they did make that movement and just completely miss out on them altogether. It's kind of like, I always think about it in that regard, when it comes to like turkey hunting, where you want to push in as close as you can to those roosting spots, because once they're down on the ground, then that potential for them to go whichever direction or that fan out from that area is greater. So you want to get in as close as you can to limit that amount of movement that they can make, and have them basically make sure that they're in range for as much as possible, or that the likelihood of them crossing your path or being within range is far greater. I'm looking at it in that same manner where now that I've kind of gone a little bit deeper yet into that area, now I know that, especially when it comes to morning, I could push even further into there, get up on that top of that hill and potentially set up where, if I were to stay down the bottom of the hill, there's a good likelihood that they're going to come through before dark, or I might miss them. Now that I'm further back where that funnel of movement is smaller, there's a much higher chance that I'm going to catch them during daylight, catch them where they're still just milling around. And, as they're getting ready for the bed, or if they bed down, I can at least be maybe in the area where I might be able to call to them and force them to come over to me, by piquing their interest. I think that I have a far greater potential for that to happen than if I were down below and only getting just a small window of their movement coming through. Again, I've started out the season very much in favor of going that route, just sticking into those transition areas and just catching them as they go through. Again, very safe ways to do about it. Far less likely to spook the deer. Basically they're cruising through and then they're moving out of the area. So, if it was an area that I wanted to make sure that I could do multiple hunts in, without, run the risk of, the deer feeling that hunting pressure or over hunting the area, that's one thing I would focus on. But again, being more aggressive and trying to push in to get closer to where they're going to spend more of their potential daylight movement in is, I think, going to be worth the risk for me. Now, things are going to get kind of interesting now that we're getting into the rut time frame. I don't know what that transition is going to do in regards to, are they going to be spending much time up in there, or are they going to be cruising more on the bottom? That is for me to, kind of keep up with the intel and basically kind of see how things go with that. One thing I have noticed too, at the other spot where I've had those two encounters, where the buck spooked, basically on closer to home, I have noticed, at least when I pulled the card from the camera, that up until this point, or up until I guess this week, a lot of the deer movement was, or at least especially the buck movement, was during the morning hours. So I was seeing a lot more trail camera pictures of the deer, going in front of the camera in the morning. Basically this past week, that seems to have flip-flopped. It's a lot of more movement during the evening than it has in the morning. So that's something I'm going to take in consideration with that spot as well. Is, I've hunted 3 or 4 sits now in the morning, and I could certainly continue to hunt the mornings in that location, but now some of the intel is suggesting that a lot more of the deer movement is happening during the evening. So I may make that switch to an evening sit there, just seeing that higher influx of deer movement, again, hedging my bets a little bit more to the likelihood of, catching that movement while on the stand. Because really, so far this season, by making the moves I have, hunting the locations I have, it really comes down to, again, doing a lot of that off-season scouting, making sure that you've got spots that, make sense that there's going to be deer movement, or that you're going to have, the potential for deer movement. Again, you could scout a spot and have it, be an absolute bust and nothing there, or, focus in on those ones that are giving that good intel. From there, by taking your camera intel, if you're running cameras, or just your observation, sits or your hunts there, is not being afraid to make a move where if you see that, you may be in the right spot, or if you need to adjust in regards to your stand location. Again, that's one nice thing about having some form of mobile setup, whether you have a portable tree stand, or if you go the saddle route, being mobile to be able to make those adjustments, even on the fly when it comes to, an individual hunt. If you're in an area where you feel like you're not in the right tree, you need to move over 20, 30 yards, with a mobile setup, you can do that relatively easily, make that switch, and not completely bugger up the hunt. The other thing is taking that intel and, either making a move. So kind of like what with the first example I gave about the buck that, spooked and now seems to be circling around a little bit further. Basically I'm looking at, that another tree that gives me a shot opportunity at that trail that deer end up using this time. Or even what I kind of looked at, before this sit, is actually moving completely to another area. It was probably a good 60, well, I guess, probably a good 70, 80 yards from where I was originally, where it's going to put me in a position where it's more up on the hilltop instead of down into the bowl itself. I can still shoot that main trail that that scrape is on. I could still shoot that trail that the buck went down the first time, and I could potentially shoot any trails that if they go up on top of the hill trying to avoid that hole, that I could still have a shot opportunity. The downfall is it does make those shots a little bit further, and being up there, it's a little bit more exposed. So, it's got to be one of those things where you got to really pinpoint which tree you want and really kind of hide behind that tree or hide in that tree as best you can, because it is going to be a little bit more mature timber in there, a lot more mature pine. You're just not going to have some of the understory or the branch cover that you would need to be able to hide in that tree. So that's one thing that I'm going to look at too. So I'm not sure if I'm really going to make that move or many more moves as we get towards the rut. I'm thinking about doing at least one more hunt in that area to try to catch up with that buck. Again, I'm hoping that as we progress into close to the rut, that he's going to start getting a little bit more lackadaisy and not as cautious as he has been. The other thing is, again, is for next year, scouting that area even more so, looking at some of those other potential trails, really pinpointing the exact spot where I'm going to get, the maximum number of potential shot opportunities. So kind of giving up ground where, I'm not going to be, making that 10 to 20 yard shot. It's going to be more like a, 20 to 30 or 35 yard shot. And then also, basically with that, trying to make sure I'm in a tree where I can still have concealment, hide my movement as much as possible, and yet still be able to anticipate, that buck if he is being cautious or, being a buck and being somewhat unpredictable. Again, we're looking at Halloween weekend, or we're looking at Halloween. It's just a few days away, and then we're going to be into November. Again, going to hunt the spot by my house here, try to get that big wide buck, try for him one more time before the rut really kicks off. I'm going to head up to the hills to try to push into that bedding area, try to capitalize on that buck movement again before November really kicks off. And then that first full week of November, I'm going to be spending basically almost every day down on my private piece. I have historical movement of the biggest bucks that show up on the property every year. Again, that property is, still designated more so as a rut property. One of the main bucks that I'm targeting, that I've been targeting for several years now, he has consistently shown up on November 7th. So from there, basically, I'm looking at the 3 days before and the 3 days after. In that time frame, I'm gonna be at the farm almost every day during that window to capitalize on if that buck still maintains that pattern and that historical movement to being on the property there. So I'm basically kind of throwing all my chips in for the rut on that property. Right now it looks like it's going to be some interesting weather, and it's just going to be just making sure I've got all my gear prepped and ready to go and plenty of warm clothing to sit for those long, all day sits. So just to kind of circle back around again, I understand that, a lot of these moves I've been making, have been potentially making it harder for myself to be able to catch on that natural pattern movement of those deer, or at least of those bucks I've been going after. The part of it is that too is I think that their pattern is, I don't really have them patterned all that well. I know the general area where they're at, but I still can't figure out, if they're, how they're going to move on a particular wind or a particular time of day, or, if it rains. And then we have high pressure, I don't have that part figured out yet. So what I have to do now is try to basically hedge my bet as to, again, narrowing down that funnel to start to limit some variables in regards to being able to get on these deer. So for this year, having these encounters, having spooked these deer like I have, it could be, at a detriment for the long term, where, at least for this season anyway. So these deer are starting to get those, that negative reinforcement that, hey, this is not a safe area. Hey, look, there's someone pushing, there's someone in here. Again, it comes down to just really focusing on, how bad of or how badly you spook them, and trying to make a play on that, and understanding that, those tendencies of those deer, they're going to react to stimuli, and you just kind of try to anticipate what that movement is going to be. Similar to like the story I already told, where, think that maybe those deer are going to try to circle downwind and, catch whatever it was or try to figure out what it was that spooked them. Again, if I had some more experience or, better understanding of how to handle that, I might have been able to capitalize and actually harvested a buck instead of having them spook that second time. But again, maybe that, having those encounters is going to make it harder for me going forward for this season. But again, that knowledge that I gained doing those doing those types of things, scouting the way I have in season, and pushing the limit of, not just thinking that those deer are in there, but actually going in there and confirming that they are. Now especially for even next year or for, future situations, I have, kind of those experiences in my back pocket now to be able to, look at the map and, see those areas like, okay, yeah, these other areas, in this spot, these deer like this area for this reason. Now I can look at this other spot here, like, hey, there's a good likelihood that they're going to like this spot because of that same reason. Again, going in there, hunt it, start to see the deer movement, understand a little bit better, make your moves and adjustments. And that's why I consider this more of what I would consider, again, that active hunting where you're not just going to just rely on that, that stationary spot and, again, tried and true. Time is on your side, where if you sit there enough times, a deer is going to make that mistake and give you that shot opportunity. Again, part of it might be that I'm just not that patient, or I'm at the point now where I just want to understand a little bit better of those situations and why I'm not picking the spots where those deer are going to be consistently coming through like I think they should be. So that's why I'm going out and trying to make things happen, or try to get to a spot where, I do have more confidence where, this is definitely where those deer are. This is their core area, not just part of their home range. They're going to be, on their feet more. So during daylight, give me that more potential for a shot opportunity if I'm here hunting. So we'll see how it goes for this next week. Again, going to kind of do my Hail Mary on some of these public land spots of trying to get one of these deer before the rut fully kicks off. And then I transition my focus to the private piece, spend the week on that private partial, and then from there we're looking at opening day for rifle season, and then gonna have the first 2 days of opener, and then I make my trip out with my buddy Dwayne out to South Dakota for him to go out and hunt whitetail out there. And then we'll be back for Thanksgiving, and then we'll be doing our annual Thanksgiving or day after Thanksgiving drive. So the next month is going to be cram-packed with hunting, and I hope that I'm able to, capitalize on some of these bucks. Again, I've had more encounters with bucks that would be potentially the biggest I've ever hunted this year, and I hold that a lot to some of the moves I've been making, being more aggressive and trying to make it happen instead of just hoping that it'll happen, essentially. It's one of those things that, at some point I would probably have, scouted those areas in the off season anyways, but nothing can beat, I think, intel that you get during in-season scouting and making those physical observations in the season. But that's it for this episode. Again, if you like this episode, make sure that you hit that like button. If you're not subscribed to the show already, make sure you don't miss out and subscribe. That way you get all the episodes when they release. And again, if you're looking for a little bit more, head on over to mihuntingpodcast.com. Check out the website. And if you want to support the show directly, make sure you become a member or sign up for our monthly newsletter. All right, and with that, as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.